on? There we go. Glad you're all here tonight. I will be checking phones. I should have everybody put one in a basket so you can't check the scores or anything like that. If the guys can figure out how to put the game up behind me, I might not even notice. Glad you're here tonight. Hope you will enjoy our time together and be blessed by it. We probably won't go an incredibly long time tonight. I was telling the guys in the back, when I worked in Searcy, we had this thing that they did where at the last Sunday of the first month of every quarter, there would be a potluck. Remember those? There would be a potluck after our morning service, and then we'd have an abbreviated afternoon devotional service, and then we were done for the day. And it so happened to coincide with Super Bowl Sunday back in those days when it was at the end of January. And everyone at the church understood that's why it started. And it was kind of funny. They actually had 3 other potlucks throughout the year just to excuse the one in January. And then if you'll remember, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, they moved the Super Bowl to the first Sunday in February, and no one knew what to do. Because if we move it, we acknowledge that's why we're doing it in the first place. If we don't move it, we're actually not having a Sunday night service the week before the Super Bowl, which seems kind of odd. And what do? That. We kept doing it the last Sunday in January, and then that Sunday in February, I watched as most of the Harding football coaches at the time went to church with us, and they were a little antsy because it was football, and they wanted to be there. So anyway, glad you're here. For those who are here, for those who are watching, and you have me on one screen and the football on the other screen, shame on you. Put that screen down and just have the us screen for now. We're going to talk about consistency, ironically enough, tonight. As I think of consistency, we'll start as we have with a definition from Webster's Dictionary right here. Consistent. Consistent is marked by harmony, regularity, or steady continuity, free from variation or contradiction. So it's none of us, basically, because we at some point or another are going to fall into any one, if not all of these things. Or secondly, it is showing steady conformity to character, profession, belief, or custom. So basically, it's kind of a what you see is what you get kind of life. Now, when I thought of talking about consistency tonight, and I debated, by the way, if you've not picked up on this pattern yet, I thought about consistency and I thought about awareness tonight because both of them fit into our story from this morning. And that's what I've been doing throughout the series so far. Now you can start trying to pick up on it. I will look at the stories we're doing in the morning and think of what's something here that's in the story we can unpack a little more. And that's what we'll talk about on Sunday night most of the time. But as we talk about consistency tonight, one of the first things that came to my mind was back in youth ministry days, there was the beginning of this thing called Facebook. And I remember being there at least as it kind of got public. I'm sure it started a little bit earlier than what I knew. But in 2006, I started having kids in our youth group tell me about this thing called Facebook. And for those who were around at the very beginning of it as it went public, the way it worked was you had to have an educational email address to be able to have Facebook. And you had to get an invitation from somebody who had one of those if you weren't. And so I kept looking for a high school student that thought I was cool enough to be okay to be on Facebook. And finally, one of our youth group members invited me after a little while. And so I got a Facebook account. And it was all downhill from there. But as I got this account, I started to see some of what they were doing and the pictures they were posting, all that stuff. And then after a few months of it, I realized this thing that was happening. Our high school students would have and high school students, by the way, because there was even an age requirement for Facebook at the time. Our high school students would have one account that was the one everyone knew about, or at least all the grown-ups knew about. And their parents were friends with that account, and their youth minister was friends with that account. And every now and then I would think of, I wonder if I'm friends with so-and-so on Facebook, and I would plug their name into a search, and then their name would pop up, the one I'm a friend with, and one that looked strangely just like them that I was not a friend with. And it was before there were people hacking Facebook accounts and all that stuff where you got the weird requests. And what it was they had dueling accounts. And they had the account that was the church parent youth minister version of themselves. And they had the account that was their friends version of themselves. None of you would ever do this, by the way. But this is kind of the way they did things. And as I started to call them out on it, because I thought I'll have one of these you brood of vipers moments in Bible class, I started to call them out on it. They just didn't understand the inconsistency of it all. And so we talked a lot about who are we? And why is there one version of ourselves that people that are church people know, and why is there a different version of ourselves that other people know? And I think for most of us, we don't want to live this way, but our world tries to push us in this direction, and sometimes we just begin to buy in. And so we're going to look at consistency through a few angles of Scripture tonight, beginning with our God, the God that we serve, who is consistent. And because his nature is consistency, I think that is one of the pieces of his nature that we can pick up on and try to emulate. So a couple things about God's consistency. First, in James chapter 1 and verse 17, it says, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." Okay, so God is one that is unchanging. Now, that does not mean God is incapable of doing something differently than what he set out to do in the first place. Because if that is not true, then that whole discussion with him and Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah was just for show. And when I read that chapter, I don't think that's just for show. I think Abraham is really asking God, if it's this, will you do it? And God is truly saying, yes, if it's that, I'll do it. Yes, I had this thing in mind that I'm going to do, but instead, because of what you've said, I will honor that and I will change it if that happens. Or when Moses goes to God, and God's plan is, I'm done with these complaining Israelites, we're just going to start over again. And Moses says, well, hang on a second. Don't you remember this thing called the covenant? This thing that you have promised long ago that they're going to be your people and we're going to do all these things. And if you do that, you're going back on your word. And God says, oh yeah. And not that God forgets or doesn't remember, but God has one thing in mind, and Moses reminds him of something, and God changes his mind. So it's not that God is not capable of doing something differently, but God is consistent in who that he is. So much to the point that it's not even that there's an unchangingness about God, there's not a shadow of change. And that is to say, there's not even an inkling. It's not something that God does. And then in Psalm chapter 102, verses 25 through 27, it says, "Of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. So you will remain. You are the same." And then we learn that God's plan also is consistent. So not just the God that we serve himself, it makes sense that if this is who he is, then also the things that he does and the way that he plans will be consistent. In Psalm 33 and verse 11, it says, "The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations." So we talk about this concept quite a bit, the idea that God has planned for us long before there even was creation. God had in mind what would happen, how things would go, how we would fall away from him, how he would bring us back to him, the fact that he's willing to sacrifice his son. All of these things were set in motion, and they will not change. We can count on them. And then in Psalm 89, beginning in verse 29, "I will establish his offspring forever, and his throne as the days of the heavens." He's talking about David here. "If his children forsake my law and do not walk according to my rules, if his children forsake my law and do not walk according to his rules, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with the rod and their iniquity with stripes." So there will be consequences that come with what they do. "But I will not remove from him my steadfast love, or be false to my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips." So he's going to be consistent. Even when there's punishment that comes, even when there's consequence that comes, he is still going to stand alongside his people. And this line of David that's going to come, that's going to lead to Jesus, is going to lead to our salvation as well as theirs. Also, God wants us to live consistently. So this consistent God who has consistent plans, it stands to reason that he's going to want us to be consistent as well. And this is probably where it gets a little more challenging for us, because we struggle with consistency. We struggle with reacting the same to things. Have you ever caught yourself reacting very angrily about something and thinking to yourself, something similar to that happened before and I didn't react at all like that? Have you found yourself being frustrated by something that doesn't always frustrate you? Have you found yourself being in a place where you know what you should be doing and the godly thing to do and the consistent thing to do, and instead you choose maybe easy, or you choose the thing that will bring this thing to a resolution faster and you don't want to worry about all the standards you may have? I think we don't acknowledge those things outright a lot, but we're not always as consistent as we should be. In Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, Paul writes, "I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called." This reminisces a lot, by the way, to Philippians 1 that we studied in Philippians not long ago, that God wants us to live in this worthy manner. But he continues in verse 2 and 3, "With all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." So as we're living this consistent, worthy kind of life, it will cause unity to come about, and it will help us to be more at peace with one another. God also wants us to speak consistently. So if we can get down the idea of living in a consistent way, sometimes the things we say are inconsistent, aren't they? Let me tell you something. When you stand in front of a group of people and taught for 25 minutes on a Sunday morning and however many minutes on a Sunday evening and try to say the same consistent thing throughout, but still have it different enough that people want to listen to it, I get this. It is hard at times to be consistent. And there will be times where my wife will say something to me and she'll say, but you said, and I will say, I never said that. And there's probably about a 98.2% chance she's right, maybe slightly higher than that, but there's a good chance that I said that, but somewhere along the way my mind changed, I want to do something different, and I don't always speak as consistently as I should. Sometimes I say things I don't mean, or sometimes I say things I don't want to mean, but maybe deep down I do mean, as we looked at this morning. We'll look at it again here in a second. Matthew 5, verse 37, Jesus says, let what you say simply be yes or no, anything more comes from evil. Which is to say, as we looked at the Sermon on the Mount several weeks back, say what you mean what you say. Be truthful in it. Be forthright in it. You don't need a whole bunch of oaths to go behind it. You don't need to make sure your fingers weren't crossed. You don't have to say all the things just right. It's not a bunch of legalese. This is what it is. And the things that I say you can count on. And when we look at God, that's who God is. God is not creating a law to create loopholes, to create ways to catch us or anything like that. God is consistent in his speech. And then where we saw this morning, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So the reason we want to be consistent in what we say is because it reveals who we are. And maybe we should have put these in reverse order, the idea of living consistently and talking consistently, but they're very related. If we will live more consistently, I think we will find that the words we say will be much more consistent as well. And if we're not being consistent in our words, then we need to look inward to our lives to see where is it that the inconsistency begins. God also wants us to be consistent examples. So it's not just between us and him. It's not even necessarily just between us and others in the church. We are living consistent lives because the people around us see that. In 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 12, Paul says, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. There are times I think we are very clear with ourselves that people around us see what we're doing and make some sort of decisions based on that. But too often, we're not thinking of that at the times that we need to be thinking of that. There are a lot of times we don't act the way we need to act, talk the way we need to talk, be the friends we need to be, love people the way we need to love them. And so Paul says to us that we need to be living this out in front of everybody. The words we say, the actions we take are important. And then Peter in 2 Peter 3:10 says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. So all the things that we think are secret, all the things that we think we're in control of, it's all going to go away. And then in verse 11 he says this, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? This kind of gets to the root to it, doesn't it? What kind of people do you want to be? When people talk about you, I had a professor at Harding that used to ask this question, what do you want them to say at your funeral? And he had us for an assignment come in one day, and for a bunch of 20-year-olds, it was kind of the weirdest thing in the world to do. But he had us all come in, and we sat down, and we had a prayer to be in the class, and then he said, write your eulogy. And I thought, I don't want to think about this. This is kind of morbid right now. I don't really want to get into this mode. But he said, you know, you're the one who's going to live this out, and you're also the one who's never going to hear it. They're going to get up, and they're going to talk about you one day, and what are they going to say? Because although they are in control of that to some degree, and doing what I do, I have been in a lot of rooms where people are talking about this and what's going to be said and what's not going to be said. And sometimes those are tearful, wonderful moments with laughter and joy and even sadness and all that. And sometimes you will be there with a family that is really struggling to say something good about the person who they're trying to memorialize there. And the professor said to us, you get to live in such a way that determines what's going to be in that. Now, you're writing it out now just as an exercise, but people at some point in your life, for every one of us, by the way, unless God comes back first, somebody is going to sit in a room with somebody else with a pad and paper or whatever they use at that point, technology-wise, and they're going to decide what can be wrapped up in what we're willing to pay for in the newspaper, and then what can be wrapped up in what people are willing to listen to as they sit in church pews somewhere along the way. And what was your life? And so what Peter says to us is we need to live a life that people are going to see. Not just the people that are closest to us, by the way, but those we come into contact with in different times in life. Those people we come into contact with just once. How will they be affected by that? People we see fairly regularly but aren't the people that will be at the funeral. What do they see in us? And so we want to live these lives that are consistent lives. God also wants us to judge and to forgive consistently. It seems like the opposite of everything you hear pointed at for Christians nowadays. We're not supposed to judge, right? Well, we are supposed to judge, but in a certain way. Jesus says this in Matthew 7, "Judge not, that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you." So we want to be consistent in that, don't we? Have you ever, somewhere at some point in your life, been punished in such a way that was very different than the way you were punished for exactly the same thing at another time? And you've just been so frustrated by that and you didn't know what to do about it? I've mentioned to some of you, and for those who are visiting, I finished college the first time out. I say I finished, I was done with it, and they were done with me. After 4 years, I was done. I was out of money, I was out of time, I had switched my major 2 or 3 times, didn't know what I was going to do with life, and especially by that last semester, I was done. I'd kind of cashed out in my head already. I went home, worked for a little while. When I went back, I had to, because of the way I had done it the first time out, repeat a couple of those classes. I don't recommend this, by the way, it costs a lot of money. But I had to repeat a couple of those classes. And there was a time that I had to repeat a class, and I still had the paper from the first time around. And so I looked at that paper, and I thought, well, I'm not going to just turn it in again, but I'm going to look through it, kind of see what I did, and I'm going to look at the instructions for the paper this time, and I wrote a paper very similar to the first one, not because I was trying to cheat or copy or plagiarize myself or any of that kind of stuff, but because I really thought I'd done a pretty good job the first time, and the first time I still had that paper with a C right on the front of it. I remember going to the professor afterwards and saying, "Why is it a C?" I showed him the rubric that we were given. I said, "I did everything that we were supposed to do. I can't figure out what I did wrong." And he looked me in the eye and he said, "Mr. Lewis, that is a C paper." I said, "Why? I know, it's got the label right there on the front. I knew that before I came in here. But can you explain to me exactly where did I fall short? What did I do wrong?" And he said, "That is a C paper." And I thought to myself, this discussion is going nowhere. Didn't say it out loud, but I was thinking it inside. And so I left and tucked my tail between my legs and moved on. Had to take that class again, wrote a very similar paper. Got an A on it. I did not go in his office and ask why it was an A paper. But I felt like I have been measured very differently in these two cases. When we live lives that are inconsistent, when we speak inconsistently, when we judge inconsistently, people don't know what to do with that. And unfortunately, what is it that we do? Because I will tell you, the world around us that loves to point, at least at the first part of this verse, and tells, hang on a second, you're not supposed to judge. They also know, by the way, that gossip is in there. They know gossip is somewhere in there, and they also know what happens at church. Gossip. And so when we point out something else that's in there that's not the sin that we struggle with, they think to themselves, you're not consistent. And when I look at the world that's around me right now, if I'm a non-Christian looking at us, I've already got that. If I'm looking for inconsistency, I don't have to go far. Turn on the TV. You will find inconsistent. If you go home and watch the rest of the game tonight, or if you've got it on your DVR and you will start it from pause when you get back, you will find some inconsistent messaging going on throughout that thing. I have watched that again and again in culture, and I hate it when it creeps into church, but it does far too often. So first he says to judge in the way you want to be judged, which is, I hope, pretty mercifully, because that's what most of us need. We need an awful lot of grace and mercy. And then secondly, to forgive. In Matthew 6 and verse 14, preceding what we just read, he says, for if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. When it comes to God forgiving me, I don't know if I want that sentence to start with an if. And the if here is, if you forgive other people, then God will forgive. And I don't know about you, but if there is anyone I want forgiving me, it's God. I hope if I wrong you, you'll forgive me too, but my life will continue if you don't. But if I wrong God and I'm not forgiven by God, I've got a serious problem on my hands. And so Jesus says, I want you to judge consistently, but I also want you to forgive consistently. And then God wants us to serve consistently. In 1 Peter 4 and verse 10, he says, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. God has given so much to us. He has shown so much grace to us. And he says, in turn, you need to go out and give and show and serve that to others. And then in Matthew 6, verse 24, he says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So our serving is not just of each other consistently, but also of God consistently. When God is constantly getting what's left over, that is not how God intended things to work. When God is constantly getting the version of us that says, well, I can do this and still be good with God, God says, no, I come first. And so he wants us to be consistent in that. So this might bring the question to us, what does a consistent life look like? I think we could see a lot of these around us in people. You probably have an example of these in your own life. I know there are people here tonight that are examples of this for me. But biblically speaking, we could pick a lot of different ones, but I want to choose one tonight, Daniel. One, because it's familiar to a lot of folks that have grown up in church. And honestly, to even some of you, if you're not, have not been around church a lot, you may have heard this story somewhere along the way, especially when it comes to Daniel and the lion's den. But there's a little more to Daniel's life than that. When we think of Daniel, starting in verse 5 of chapter 1 of his book, it says, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food the king ate. So the story is, God's people have come into exile. And there are some of the people that the king there has chosen out that he's trying to kind of train them in this new way. It says they'd given the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank, they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, which we won't really refer to, you don't hear of Belteshazzar in the lion's den. And then Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So some of those guys we know a little better by their other name. The intent of all this was to change them. So the king pulls these kind of the best out of the younger guys because he thinks, like a lot of us would, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And so we're going to get these younger guys and begin, maybe the word we'd use nowadays is to indoctrinate. And so we're going to train them in what is our culture. They're going to eat our foods, they're going to see the things that are important to us, and they are going to become like us. We are going to dissolve what used to be the old them as Israelites, and they're going to become Babylonians just like the rest of us. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. I love the way this verse begins, but Daniel resolved. Because when you are taken prisoner, you don't make the calls anymore, do you? When you're taken prisoner, you don't make the decisions anymore. You kind of do what they tell you to do. And if you were a prisoner and they have pulled you out of what is a more difficult life and brought you in closer to the king and given you the good food and the good wine and the good experience, how many people would just kind of count themselves as blessed at that point? You know, I could be down there where things are worse, and look here where I am. I'm actually among kind of the upper crust of folks. But Daniel resolved to not be like that. And that would make Daniel's life in a lot of ways difficult. How easy would it be just to kind of go along with what's going on? If you do go home and watch the Super Bowl tonight and you watch the commercials, there will be commercials of things of lifestyle and morality and ethics that do not match up to the things that you have grown up with if you've been around church. And there is a struggle in our world that says all that stuff is fine. You can do all of this and you'll still be okay. And the question is, are we being consistent? Are we being the people that God called us to be? So it says that God gave Daniel favor in the compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And sometimes that's what God does. Although honestly, as we kind of progress in the story of Daniel, it may not look like favor and compassion to us. We'd probably define that a little bit differently. But Daniel lost favor with some. Even though he had this favor with God, even though God made it so that he could kind of rise up in the ranks, there were people who didn't like that. Have you ever experienced this, by the way? You live life the way that you do things the right way at work or at school, and people around you do them in a different way. And what are you? If you're in school, you're the teacher's pet, you're a goody two-shoes. If you're at work, I don't even know what the labels are anymore, but they look at you differently, like you're trying to gain favor with somebody. And so people around Daniel got annoyed. And the people around Daniel got annoyed. In chapter 6, it says, these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So they look at Daniel and they're so frustrated with him, and they don't like him, but they also recognize we can't find a ground for complaint with him. We can't point at something Daniel is doing and saying, But king, how can you let him rise like this? Because look at all of these wrong things he's doing, because Daniel is living so consistently. It cannot be denied. When we look at all those verses about consistent speech and consistent action and service and all those things, when we are living consistent lives like that, people around us don't know what to do with it. And some of them will think, well, you're just, you think you're better than everybody else, and they'll try to point out different things. But in the end, we're kind of like those people that Peter describes in 1 Peter 3, that when they speak slander against us, it's going to be clear that this is not who we are. And so these people, they can't find a complaint against Daniel, so they come up with an idea. They see that Daniel prays to his God all the time, and so they say, well, let's get the king to make a law that says you cannot pray to anybody else other than him. There's no other deity other than the king, and because of that, Daniel, if he keeps praying, he'll be breaking the law. And so what we find out about Daniel in verse 10 is that when Daniel knew the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had the windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees there 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. And I like the way that verse ends. As he had done previously. You can make all the laws you want to make. You can threaten me with all the threats you want to threaten me with. And I am going to keep doing the thing that honors God, regardless. What if today, in America in 2022, what if everyone who professed to follow Jesus lived this way? What if they looked at everything that's going on in our culture, everything that's going on in our government, everything that's going on in our world, everything that's going on in society around them, the way standards have changed, all of that, and they said, it does not matter what law you make. It does not matter what you tell me is all right or what I must do. I am going to continue serving God in the way that honors him regardless. And consequences can come my way because of that. But the God I serve is more powerful than whatever those consequences are anyway, which is kind of Daniel's attitude. He doesn't know, spoiler alert, by the way, he's going to get thrown in the lion's den as a result of this, and God's going to close the mouths of the lions. He doesn't know that's how it's going to turn out. He knows that's a distinct possibility. He knows he serves a God that's capable of that, but he also knows he could be thrown in the lion's den and be supper that night. Could turn out either way. He is going to do it anyway. Think of all the things Daniel could have done. I love the story, but think of how it could have gone. Daniel could have said, all right, I've tried. I didn't eat the food I wasn't supposed to eat. I've tried to honor God in this. I've prayed all up to this point, but God hasn't answered my prayer clearly because here's this law, and it's unjust, and what else can I do at this point? And so I've got no hope. I'm just going to stop praying. Or maybe he could have gone clandestine with his prayer, and he could have said, got these open windows there in the upper room. Let's close them. Let's put something in front of it. Let's go to a different part of the house. Let's do this at a different time. I mean, you could be praying. I'll assume anybody whose eyes closed right now, you're praying right now. You could be praying right now. I wouldn't know it. I would have no reason to know it. Daniel could have done this any number of ways. And what does Daniel do? He's not just living a consistent life. He's living this consistent life of example before everybody. And God honors that. So what are we doing tonight? And maybe the other question for us here is, when are we inconsistent? Because if you came into this tonight, you think to yourself, well, I'm consistent. I don't know who this is for. These other people here have problems. There must be enough people. He's talking about it. There's got to be We all have moments of inconsistency. And I would ask you this. Maybe this is a good place to start. Think of 5 sins that you are most likely to condemn somebody else of. You may not do it out loud. You may not go to them and call them brood of vipers or Pharisees and hypocrites or anything like that. But in your mind, when someone does this thing, you think to yourself, this person's not worthwhile. This person is so ungodly. I cannot believe they're doing this. Or maybe it's a repetitive sin. I cannot believe they've fallen in this again. Think of the 5 first ones that come to your mind, or maybe people that come to your mind because of them. And then ask yourself, why do I feel this way about these 5 things or these 5 people? And I wonder, if we could get past just for a minute, we'll acknowledge whatever those things are wrong, because I hope most likely whatever you're thinking of, they are wrong things. But there are a lot of wrong things that don't bother us, or at least not enough that we talk about it or are frustrated by it or think the people that do them are horrible people or anything like that. Why are they different than these 5 things? And I think a lot of the real true answer to that is our inconsistency. Maybe it's I don't struggle with those, so I don't understand them. And I will tell you, by the way, I am as guilty of this as anybody. There are sins that I have absolutely no temptation toward. And so when people fall into those, I think to myself, how can you let yourself be controlled by something so trivial as that? Something so easily avoidable as that? And yet at the same time, I am as impatient as they come. And it's a fruit, the fruit of the Spirit that we read about, all those different things. It's something that should be living within me, patience, but I will explain all the reasons why it's not what it could be. Because I am inconsistent. Things that bother me that other groups do, why they bother me so much? Because I'm inconsistent. And before God, what I want to be is someone who is inconsistent. So maybe that's the place we start. Where are we inconsistent? But in living consistent lives, what if, and we'll end with this. There was a story several years ago of somebody who got a phone call. This is pre-caller ID days, so it's kind of hard to tell this story anymore. Pre-caller ID days, got a phone call. It was a voice they did not recognize. And all the voice said when the person picked up the phone was, "Your secret is out, everybody knows." And then they hung up the phone. Do you imagine the terror of some people at that point? Now, there are some of you who are living life in such a way that you would think to yourself, I have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. There are some who are living life in such a way that think, you start writing a list. Could be this one, could be this one, could be this. This one, if people found out, yeah, I'd prefer not that, but this one would be life-altering, and what would I do? And the way the story goes was, the guy immediately went and started packing up his house. Call U-Haul, got a truck out there, and he left town. Could have been a wrong number for all he knows, but his life was forever changed, and it was because of a lack of consistency. That consistency will make your life so much easier. When you're not having to worry about what story somebody knows, when you're not having to worry about what thing about you somebody has seen, when somebody sees you and your life is exactly what it's supposed to be, you are living the life that God has designed. If you are not living that life, I will tell you, you are not alone. If you think to yourself, I'm the only one sitting here on my pew and everybody else has got it all together, there's a lot of that going around, the inconsistency. But at the same time, don't let that excuse it. We can all be better than we are. And if you're inconsistent tonight, the first step is to change that and to be different. To be a person who does what you say, to be a person that says things that are honoring to God and come directly from your heart, and to be a person that has the heart of God. If you are inconsistent in life, you can begin a walk with Him of consistency by following Him, by confessing His name, by being baptized into Him, and your life can be changed forever. Or if your life has lost that consistency and you need it back, you can bring it back to Him tonight. You can begin to live for Him again and be the person He wants you to be. If there's some way we can help you tonight, please come while we stand and sing.